In the summer of 1940, the skies above Britain became a battlefield. While the world watched in silence, a handful of young Americans risked everything, crossing borders, forging identities, defying their own government, to fight in a war that was not yet theirs. They weren't supposed to be there. They weren't supposed to survive. But when the Luftwaffe came, these men climbed into Spitfires and Hurricanes and faced death with nothing but courage and a desperate hope that history would remember them. This is the untold story of the outlaw pilots who flew for freedom before America entered the war. The train rattled northward, every clatter of the wheels sounding like a warning. Two young Americans sat rigid in their seats, trying to look like nothing more than tourists on a casual trip to Canada. Their clothes were plain, their manner forced into calmness. Yet beneath the folded shirts in their suitcases lay helmets, goggles, and logbooks, the unmistakable tools of aviators. If discovered, those objects would brand them not as travelers but as criminals. At the border, the train shuddered to a halt. The doors opened, and stern officials boarded, their faces as cold as the winter air. Questions cut through the silence. Where are you going? Why? One officer leaned closer, eyes narrowing, his voice deliberate. Are you flyers? The Americans laughed nervously. Do we look like flyers? The officer searched their luggage, pawing through shirts and socks, but never venturing deep enough to uncover the truth. The suitcases snapped shut. The officer moved on, and with that, luck or fate allowed them to continue. For Eugene, Red Tobin, and Andy Mamedoff, this was more than a trip across a border. It was a passage into another world, a gamble that could end in glory or in prison. The United States had declared itself neutral. The law was unambiguous. Joining the armed forces of a nation at war was a crime. 10 years in prison, $20,000 in fines, an impossible fortune for young men of modest means. And worst of all, the loss of citizenship, the erasure of identity. Others had already paid the price. A group from California, eager to enlist, had been intercepted by the FBI. Faced with the choice between a cell and a humiliating return home, they turned back. But determination has a way of mutating into defiance. Those same men would eventually find another route, slipping past the eyes of their own government and reaching England where the war raged above the Channel. It was a dangerous paradox. Their own nation forbade them to fight, yet every headline told of London in flames, of Europe collapsing under the weight of Nazi aggression. These young Americans believed neutrality was nothing less than abandonment. The sky was calling, and they could not ignore it. Thus began the exodus, hundreds of American volunteers slipping quietly into Canada, cloaking themselves as students, workers, or casual visitors. Some succeeded by chance, others by guile, and a few by forging papers that could have condemned them for life. Each step across the frontier was a rebellion, not only against law but against their own country's will. For Tobin and Mamedoff, that crossing was the first true combat. Not with bullets or engines, but with silence, deception, and the steady pounding of their own hearts as they walked into exile. Behind them lay the safety of neutrality. Ahead, only danger, yet in that danger they found purpose. The road to the Royal Air Force had begun, not in the cockpit of a Spitfire, but in the narrow aisle of a Canadian-bound train, where two young men gambled everything they were, to fight in a war their country had not yet chosen to enter. The war demanded masks long before the pilots ever climbed into their cockpits. For the Americans who crossed into Canada, the most dangerous weapon they carried was not a pistol or a rifle, but a passport, a single document, stamped with the wrong seal, marked with the wrong birthplace, could mean freedom, or a noose of prison walls. Among these shadowed figures was Hugh Riley, a young man born in the United States, who found himself in need of an identity that did not exist. To fly for Britain while his own nation stood neutral was to invite ruin. And so Riley undertook a gamble worthy of a spy. He obtained a Canadian passport. How he managed this remains a mystery wrapped in whispers. Those who aided him swore eternal silence, for the truth could have destroyed them as surely as the German bombs falling on London. The Neutrality Acts of the American Congress were merciless. Written in the 1930s to shield the country from foreign entanglements, they made it a crime to serve under the flag of a warring nation. 10 years of imprisonment, a fine greater than most families would earn in their lifetimes. The stripping of citizenship, leaving the offender as a man without a nation. The law was meant to keep America safe. To these volunteers, it felt like chains fastened by their own government. Thus, men like Riley lived in deception. On paper, he was Canadian. On the roster of the Royal Air Force, he was an officer. In truth, he was an American, a shadow wrapped in another man's skin. In September of 1940, he was posted to 64 Squadron, and within weeks shifted again to 66 Squadron. There he fought in the desperate air battles that defined the autumn skies over England. On the 15th of September, the day history would later name the Battle of Britain Day, Riley flew among the outnumbered defenders who rose to meet the German tide. Only 4 days later, he shot down a Messerschmitt, a victory won with both courage and the secret weight of his false identity pressing against him. 3 weeks beyond that, fate closed its hand. A German ace struck him down and Riley's aircraft fell. He was buried not as an American, not as a fraud, but as a pilot of the Royal Air Force in a quiet churchyard at Gravesend. His passport of lies was interred with him, his secret sealed beneath English soil. He was not alone in this masquerade. Dozens of Americans wore the cloaks of Commonwealth nations. Some claimed Canadian birth, others placed themselves in far-off dominions. Records listed them as subjects of the Empire, though their voices betrayed accents from Illinois, Texas, or New Jersey. Behind each name lurked a gamble that the fiction would never be unmasked. The need for secrecy was not only legal but practical. If captured alive, a Luftwaffe officer could easily learn of their true citizenship. Should the information spread, the American government might brand them criminals. Their families could face investigation, shame, perhaps even prosecution. And so the pilots held their tongues, living double lives in which silence was as vital as oxygen. This hidden world shaped the very character of the early American flyers in the Royal Air Force. They fought not for recognition, but in spite of it. They were faceless men in borrowed uniforms, risking not only death in battle but disgrace in life. For them, every victory in the air was shadowed by the knowledge that, on the ground, they existed as ghosts of nations not their own. Theirs was a war within a war, against the enemy above and against the truth within. In that struggle, Hugh Riley became both symbol and sacrifice, the man who proved that even a false name could die with honor when carried by steady hands and an unbroken will. The summer of 1940 unfolded with fire and smoke above the Channel. It was here, in the narrow stretch of sky between England and occupied France, that a handful of American volunteers first tasted the brutal reality of aerial combat. They were scattered among British squadrons, hidden behind assumed identities, but when the call to scramble came, their accents gave them away. One of the earliest to rise into battle was Jimmy Davies. Born in New Jersey, but made into a fighter pilot by the crucible of Britain's desperate need. He had already proven his skill months before, when he and a comrade shared the destruction of a German Donahue bomber, the first enemy aircraft to fall at the hands of a Biggin Hill pilot. By June of 1940, Davies had already claimed a string of victories. He was, in truth, the first American ace of the war. Though few outside his squadron would ever know his name, his story illustrates the cruel mathematics of air combat. Every engagement was a dance of seconds, every misjudgment a death sentence. Davies survived long enough to bring down 8 enemy aircraft, a tally that should have secured him fame. Instead, his recognition was buried beneath layers of secrecy, overshadowed by the politics of neutrality. He died in the summer skies, his triumphs scattered like the wreckage of the Messerschmitts he had hunted. Not far from him, another American-born pilot carved his place in the annals of the Battle of Britain. Carl Davis of 601 Squadron, though raised partly in South Africa, carried the blood of American parents. He was a man of contrasts, a product of privilege yet fearless in combat. Between July and early September, he destroyed 11 enemy aircraft. He flew with the Millionaires Squadron, a unit of men whose uniforms were lined with silk, whose arrogance was matched only by their skill. But the sky is merciless. On the 6th of September, his Hurricane fell inverted into the fields near Tunbridge Wells. He was buried in Sussex, his victories immortalized only in fading squadron records. These men fought within the Great Storm that became the Battle of Britain. From July through October, German bombers and fighters poured across the Channel in relentless waves, determined to crush the Royal Air Force and open the way for invasion. Every day of clear weather brought combat. Every evening, pilots counted the empty chairs in the mess hall. To be an American in those ranks was to live a double exile, unwelcome at home, unacknowledged in Britain, yet bound to fight as if both nations depended on them. The first skies of battle offered no illusions. Victory was measured not in medals, but in survival from one day to the next. For Davies, and for the unnamed Americans who flew in borrowed uniforms, the summer of 1940 was not merely a test of courage. It was proof that the line between legend and oblivion could be as thin as a single burst of machine gun fire. They were strangers in another nation's war, but in the firelit skies above London and Kent, they became brothers to the men beside them. And when they fell, their graves became silent witnesses that nationality meant little against the immensity of death and the desperate need to hold the line. Among the most striking of the American volunteers was William Meade Lindsley Fiske III, known simply as Billy Fiske. Born in Chicago, heir to a banking fortune, educated at Cambridge, and married into British aristocracy, he was a man of wealth and privilege. Yet in the summer of 1940, he chose to exchange the velvet halls of London society for the cramped cockpit of a Hawker Hurricane. Fiske's path into the Royal Air Force was smoothed by connections. While other Americans risked arrest, forged papers and secrecy, he simply joined the Auxiliary Air Force with ease. He was posted to 601 Squadron, a unit whose members came from the upper echelons of British society. They were nicknamed the Millionaires' Squadron, and they embraced the title with style. Their uniforms were custom-tailored, lined with silk. Their demeanor was as bold on the ground as in the air. Other squadrons hated them, envied them, and mocked them. But when the sirens wailed and the engines roared, they flew into the storm like the rest. Billy Fiske did not arrive as an intruder. He was welcomed. Squadron Commander Archie Hope, who also happened to be the brother-in-law of fellow American Carl Davis, described him as the best pilot I have ever known. His skill seemed natural, his charm disarming. Beneath the veneer of wealth, he carried an ease that made him beloved among his comrades. In mid-August, Fiske proved his mettle. During one of his earliest sorties, he downed a German Junkers bomber, sending the smoking wreck into the Channel. Days later, fate struck back. His Hurricane was savaged by Messerschmitt fighters, bullets tearing through its frame. Somehow, Fiske wrestled the wounded machine back to base, crash-landing at Tangmere Airfield. He was pulled from the cockpit with burns across his hands and face, but still alive, still smiling. His comrades believed he would recover. That night, he lay in the hospital. His commander came to visit, reassured by the sight of him awake, his wounds seemingly manageable. Yet hours later, word spread like a funeral bell. Billy Fiske was dead. He had succumbed not to burns or broken bones, but to shock, the silent killer that no surgeon could defeat. He was only 29 years old. In the official records, Billy Fiske became the first recognized American pilot to die in the Battle of Britain. In truth, others had already fallen under assumed names buried quietly without acknowledgement. Yet Fiske's death struck a chord. Here was a man who had no need to risk anything. Wealth, reputation, and security were his by birthright. Still, he chose the path of peril. His squadron mourned him deeply. The Millionaires' Squadron, often derided as arrogant and flamboyant, carried his coffin with solemnity. His widow remembered him not as a daredevil, but as a man who believed that standing aside while Britain burned was unthinkable. In Fiske's story, the contradictions of the American volunteers came into sharp relief. He had everything to lose and lost it willingly. Others, nameless and concealed behind false citizenship, fought with nothing to gain but survival. Together, they shaped a truth that could not be denied. Whether from gilded drawing rooms or humble farm fields, the call to defend Britain transcended class, wealth, and nationality. Billy Fiske died before his country officially joined the war, yet his sacrifice echoed louder than speeches or laws. In the smoke of Tangmere, the first recognized American blood was spilled, a reminder that even in neutrality, the heart of a nation can find its way to the battlefield. Not every American who found his way into the Royal Air Force came from wealth or privilege. Among the most humble was Arthur Donahue, who called himself simply a farm boy from the small town of St. Charles in Minnesota. His background could not have been more different from the silk-lined uniforms of the so-called Millionaires Squadron. He came not from banking dynasties or aristocratic families, but from the hard soil of the American Midwest, where work was measured in sweat and the rhythm of the seasons. When France collapsed in the summer of 1940, Donahue crossed into Canada and enlisted. His journey was not marked by influence or special permission, but by sheer determination. On the 4th day of August, he arrived in England and was posted to 64 Squadron, a fighter unit stationed at Kenley, just south of London. The base was already scarred by bomb craters and smoke, a constant reminder that the battle was no longer distant. His first operational sortie nearly ended before it began. Climbing into the sky, Donahue closed in on what he believed was a German aircraft. Only after studying its silhouette carefully did he fire, certain at last it was an enemy Messerschmitt and not a British Spitfire. He scored hits damaging the machine, but the fight was not without consequence. A German cannon shell ripped through his own fuselage, nearly tearing the aircraft apart. By some miracle, Donahue coaxed the crippled fighter back to Kenley. Mechanics counted the damage. The shell had pierced the tail, shattered the wireless set, and barely missed the armor plate behind the seat. The Spitfire was ruined, needing an entirely new fuselage. Donahue himself survived with little more than bruises and the knowledge that luck had saved him. Within a week, his luck was tested again. In another clash with the Luftwaffe, his Spitfire was shot down. This time, Donahue did not walk away so easily. He was pulled from the wreckage and sent to hospital, where days passed in a haze of recovery. When at last he was fit to return, his posting changed. He was transferred to a unit still in its infancy, the 1st All-American Eagle Squadron. Donahue's presence marked a shift. Unlike Billy Fiske, who carried aristocratic polish, or Carl Davis, who navigated the world of privilege, Donahue embodied the ordinary young man who chose extraordinary risk. His calloused hands, shaped by years of farm labor, now gripped the control stick of a Spitfire. His determination carried him from the quiet fields of Minnesota to the desperate skies of Britain, where survival was measured not in harvests, but in hours lived through combat. He was a symbol of a broader truth, that the American volunteers were not a monolith of adventurers or thrill-seekers. They came from every corner of society, each driven by a conviction that neutrality was a luxury Britain could not afford. Donahue fought not for glory or fame, but because he believed the world could not wait for America to make up its mind. The farm boy who once watched crops bend under the Midwestern sun now watched tracer fire arc through the clouds. And though his story was quieter, his presence carried weight. For every American who wore silk, there was another who carried the dust of the earth into the cockpit. Together they forged a legacy of sacrifice, each one a thread in the tapestry of the Battle of Britain. In Arthur Donahue's bruised but unbroken body, Britain found proof that courage was not born of wealth, but of resolve. And in his survival, however fragile, the Eagle Squadrons took flight, nourished by the spirit of a farm boy who chose the sky over the soil. They came together not as soldiers of fortune, nor as patriots acting under orders, but as restless men who refused to be denied a war. Eugene Red Tobin, Andy Mamedoff, and Vernon Shorty Keough were unlike one another in nearly every way. Yet fate drew them into the same squadron, the same sky, and ultimately the same legend. Tobin was tall, fiery-haired, and carried the aura of a cowboy from California. His voice and manner were larger than life, and he seemed a figure drawn from Hollywood, though his skills were grounded in determination more than polish. Andy Mamedoff, lean and sharp, lived for chance and wager. He would gamble on anything, cards, dice, or even the weather. Risk was his nature, and war suited him as the ultimate bet. Then there was Shorty Keough, the paradox of the trio. Barely 4 feet and 10 inches tall, he was a veteran of air shows and carnivals. With more than 400 parachute jumps behind him, before he ever sat in a Spitfire cockpit. He needed cushions to see above the instrument panel, but once airborne his stature mattered little. The three had first crossed paths in Montreal, each escaping American law by slipping into Canada. Colonel Charles Sweeney, an American businessman with deep connections in London, had drawn them into the orbit of the Royal Air Force. Their journey was a patchwork of wars that never were. Originally recruited to fight in Finland against the Soviet Union, they were denied that chance when the conflict ended. Then they aimed for the French Air Force, only to find France collapsed before they could even take wing. Like wanderers chasing a storm, they finally arrived in England, the last arena left to them. At first, the Royal Air Force did not know what to make of them. Their hours in the air were exaggerated, their confidence flamboyant, their American accents impossible to hide. Red Tobin, for example, claimed to have flown 5,000 hours when his logbook held barely 200. Squadron leader Horace George Darley of 609 Squadron saw through the boasting. He refused to let the trio near combat until he was certain they could handle themselves. Thus their early days were spent not in glory, but in drudgery. They ferried aircraft from base to base, flew practice sorties and listened as British comrades returned with tales of aerial duels above the Channel. They were outsiders, forced to wait while others carried the weight of the battle. But war has a way of testing every man sooner or later. When German bombers struck Middle Wallop, the base they shared, Tobin narrowly escaped death as hangars erupted in fire and steel. Buried under dust, ears ringing from the concussion, he stumbled away, shaken but alive. The battle was no longer something told over drinks in the mess. It had reached out and clawed at him directly. In August, the decision came. The trio was declared operational. Their first missions were clumsy, their victories non-existent. Tobin emptied his machine guns into a German fighter and accomplished nothing but the wasting of 2,000 rounds and 80 gallons of precious fuel. Mamedoff's first combat sortie ended with his Spitfire riddled by cannon fire, a single shell tracing a path through the fuselage and halting just behind his seat. He returned with nothing more than a bruise on his back, his aircraft a total loss. Yet despite these failures, the squadron began to respect them, not because they were exceptional, but because they refused to falter. Each defeat became instruction, each humiliation a lesson. They laughed in the face of danger, carried their wounds with humor, and treated survival itself as a kind of victory. The British pilots, hardened by weeks of relentless combat, began to see in the Americans a reflection of themselves. Different accents, different postures, but the same resolve. Shorty Keough, with his childlike height and boundless enthusiasm, won hearts easily. Mamedoff, ever the gambler, embodied the very essence of combat's uncertainty. And Tobin, loud and brash, became the symbol of a spirit that refused to be silenced. Together they were outlaws, not only against American law but against expectation itself. They had no right to be in England's fight, no permission from their homeland, no guarantee of survival. Yet in their stubborn defiance, they embodied the very resilience that Britain needed in its darkest hour. They were three men against the tide of history, and though the Luftwaffe loomed vast and merciless, Tobin, Mamedoff, and Keough had finally found the war they had been chasing, across oceans and nations. In the skies of England, they were no longer fugitives. They were fighters. When the summer deepened into August of 1940, the three Americans of 609 Squadron finally entered the storm they had sought for so long. Red Tobin, Andy Mamedoff and Shorty Keough strapped themselves into their Spitfires, no longer ferry pilots or spectators to war stories told in the mess, but combatants in the sky. Their baptism of fire came swift, chaotic and merciless. On the 16th day of August, Tobin was ordered aloft in a sortie against German bombers. The day was part of Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring's Great Adlerangriff, the so-called Eagle attack, a campaign designed to annihilate the Royal Air Force. Tobin roared into the clouds, heart-pounding, and sighted a twin-engined Messerschmitt fighter. He pressed his trigger, sending streams of .303 caliber rounds into the enemy. For long seconds he fired until his guns ran dry, 2,000 bullets expended, 80 gallons of fuel consumed, yet the German escaped untouched. Below, Middle Wallop airfield was cratered and burning. Tobin landed, frustrated, his first combat a bitter lesson in how merciless the sky could be. Mamedoff's initiation came 8 days later, on the 24th of August. It was a day remembered as one of the most destructive of the entire battle, when Luftwaffe waves pounded airfields across southern England. Mamedoff engaged his first Messerschmitt, only to feel his Spitfire torn apart beneath him. A cannon shell entered the tail, shredded its way through the fuselage, splintered the radio set and lodged against the armor plate behind his seat. He limped back to base with only a bruise, his aircraft a total loss. His comrades shook their heads in disbelief. He had been inches from death, and yet smiled at his survival as if he had just won a gambler's wager. Shorty Keough, the smallest of the trio, had to wait until mid-September for his first true engagement. On the 15th day of that month, the day later celebrated as Battle of Britain Day, he joined his squadron in intercepting a massive German raid. Above London, hundreds of aircraft clashed in a swirling tempest of fire and contrails. Keough, flying tail-end Charlie, spotted a German bomber diving for safety. He joined in the attack, his guns striking home. The Donahue bomber limped away, crash-landing east of Biggin Hill. Officially, the kill was shared, half credited to Keough, half to another pilot. For the diminutive American, it was proof that size and stature meant nothing when the trigger was pulled. The days between August and September were relentless. Every dawn threatened a scramble. Every dusk revealed empty chairs in the mess, pilots who had not returned. For Tobin, the lessons came hard. In one fight, he dived too sharply after a German twin-engined fighter, pulling so many Gs that the blood drained from his head. He blacked out cold, his Spitfire spinning toward the channel. When he awoke, he was barely 1,000 feet above the waves. He recovered just in time, climbing back to base. His squadron had already mourned him, believing him dead. Instead, he staggered in, exhausted but alive. One more ghost returned from the edge. Through these weeks, the Americans proved themselves not by victory tallies, but by endurance. They made mistakes, they missed chances, yet they refused to break. Each sortie hardened them. Each brush with death stripped away the illusions of glory and replaced them with the raw understanding that survival itself was an achievement. By mid-September, Tobin had finally claimed his first confirmed kill, sending a German fighter crashing in smoke and fire. Mamedoff had nursed his bruises into stories retold with a gambler's grin. Keough had carved his name into the records with half a bomber to his credit. Small victories in the scale of the war, but monumental in their own lives. This baptism of fire transformed them. No longer outlaws sneaking across borders, they were now blooded pilots of the Royal Air Force. They had sought war as an adventure, but in the skies over England they discovered its true face, brutal, merciless, and utterly consuming. And though the battle had only begun, Tobin, Mamedoff, and Keough were already marked by it, bound forever to the fate of those who dared to rise into the storm. The 15th day of September in the year 1940 dawned like so many others in that long summer of fire, yet by nightfall it would be remembered as the turning point of the Battle of Britain. The Luftwaffe hurled its strength across the Channel once again, and the Royal Air Force, weary but unbroken, rose to meet it. For the 3 Americans of 609 Squadron, this was the day they would be thrust into the heart of one of the greatest air battles in history. Red Tobin was roused before daylight, shaken awake by a fellow pilot. He was groggy, irritated, and demanded to know why he should rise when the sun itself had not yet climbed. The answer was curt. There were rumors of an invasion. Still half asleep, Tobin stumbled to readiness. Hours later, the squadron was scrambled, engines screaming as they lifted into the pale morning. Ahead of them, the southern horizon bristled with shapes, dozens upon dozens of German aircraft, their black crosses glinting against the sun. As the formation approached London, Tobin counted nearly 100 German planes in sight, with 50 Messerschmitt fighters prowling above as escorts and another 50 bombers pushing steadily forward. It was a wall of wings and engines, an avalanche of metal aimed directly at the heart of Britain. In the melee that followed, Tobin once again found himself in the perilous role of tail-end Charlie, watching the flanks of his section. He glanced back one last time before diving and saw 3 yellow-nosed Messerschmitts descending upon him. His warning cry exploded across the radio. "Danger, Red Section! Danger, danger!" He yanked the throttle back, forcing his Spitfire into a tight turn. The Germans overshot, streaking past too fast to adjust. Tobin snapped a burst at the last of them, watching smoke trail from its fuselage as all three vanished into the chaos. Alone now, his squadron scattered, Tobin climbed back to 10,000 feet. Through the haze, he spotted a lone Dornier bomber limping toward a cloud bank. Instinct overrode exhaustion. He dived, closing the distance, and opened fire. Bullets stitched across the bomber's wing, tearing into its engine until smoke poured out. Tobin followed it down, watching as the German crew crash-landed the crippled machine east of Biggin Hill. 3 men clambered out, sitting stunned upon the wing as Tobin circled once, then turned for home. Elsewhere in the sky, Shorty Keough earned his first half-victory, joining another pilot in the destruction of a German bomber. For a man so small that he required cushions merely to see over his instrument panel, it was proof that stature meant nothing in the furnace of battle. Andy Mamedoff fought his own desperate engagements, narrowly escaping destruction once more, his aircraft peppered by gunfire, yet refusing to yield. The scale of the clash was staggering. Over the skies of London and southern England, nearly 200 British fighters tangled with more than 400 German machines. Smoke trails, burning wreckage, and parachutes dotted the heavens. Civilians below watched in awe as the battle raged above their homes. A duel of nations played out in full view of the ground. By the end of the day, the Luftwaffe's losses were crippling. Initial British reports claimed nearly 200 German aircraft destroyed, though later counts reduced the number to closer to 60. Whatever the true figure, the result was the same. The tide had turned. Hitler's planned invasion of Britain was postponed and soon after abandoned altogether. For the Americans, the day was a crucible. Red Tobin now carried confirmed victories to his name. Shorty Keough had written himself into the official records. Mamedoff, bruised but unbroken, had endured yet another brush with death. They were no longer rookies, no longer outsiders. They had become part of the living shield that held back the storm. The 15th of September proved that the Royal Air Force could not be broken. And within that proof lay the stories of 3 Americans who had crossed borders, defied their own nation's laws, and now stood shoulder to shoulder with British comrades in the moment when the fate of the free world trembled in the balance. It was not their war by birthright, yet by blood and fire it had become their own. Only 4 days after the skies above London had burned with the fury of the 15th of September, orders came down for Red Tobin, Andy Mamedoff, and Shorty Keough. They were to leave 609 Squadron and report north to Church Fenton in Yorkshire. Their destination was not yet another British unit, but something unprecedented. Number 71 Squadron, the very first Eagle Squadron, an experimental formation composed entirely of American volunteers. When the 3 arrived at Church Fenton, they were startled to find almost nothing waiting for them. There was no commanding officer, no roster of fellow pilots, and no aircraft standing on the field. For a brief, surreal moment, the so-called squadron consisted of 3 restless Americans, a name and an idea. Yet it was from this fragile beginning that the Eagle Squadrons would eventually grow into one of the most famous symbols of American participation. Before the United States entered the war, the concept had been brewing for months. Influential supporters in Britain and sympathetic figures in America envisioned units that would gather volunteers under a common banner, both to strengthen the Royal Air Force and to generate valuable propaganda. The image of Americans defying their own government's neutrality to fight alongside Britain carried immense symbolic power. If successful, the Eagle Squadrons would embody solidarity across the Atlantic before politics allowed official alliance. At first, however, there was only emptiness. Tobin, Mamedoff, and Keough settled uneasily into their new assignment, veterans of weeks of combat but now instructors by necessity. They carried with them the scars and lessons of the Battle of Britain: conserve ammunition, close in before firing, and never underestimate the enemy's capacity for sudden violence. These were not lessons taught in flight school, but written in blood across the skies of Kent and Sussex. They began to pass this hard-earned wisdom to the trickle of new volunteers who soon arrived. Wide-eyed and untested, among the first reinforcements was Chesley Pete Peterson, a young Mormon from Utah. He had initially been posted to join 609 Squadron alongside the 3 Americans, but the creation of 71 Squadron diverted him north. His arrival marked the beginning of a slow transformation from a phantom squadron into a true fighting unit. The early days were awkward. Newcomers boasted of hours flown, of daring stunts and supposed victories in mock combat back home. Tobin listened with a wry smile, remembering his own inflated claims when first joining. Now with the weight of real battle on his shoulders, he knew how little such words mattered. What mattered was whether a man could keep his head when tracers stitched across his canopy, when engines screamed, when death pressed close in a dive. Gradually, aircraft began to arrive, and with them, the sense that this squadron was real. Spitfires gleamed on the tarmac, their British roundels a sharp reminder that though the men were American, the fight was still Britain's. Training flights filled the air, young pilots learning to fly as a unit, struggling to master the discipline that survival demanded. The Eagle Squadron was not yet ready for frontline duty, but the idea alone carried weight. Newspapers whispered of American boys in British cockpits, of outlaws turned defenders. The truth was far less glamorous. Long days of drills, frustrating hours of practice, and the heavy responsibility carried by those like Tobin, Mamedoff, and Keough, who had already seen combat. They understood that without discipline, these eager recruits would be nothing more than easy prey for the Luftwaffe. Still, hope lingered in the barracks at Church Fenton. Though their homeland still stood officially aloof, here was proof that American courage had already taken flight. For the 3 original Eagles, it was a strange new chapter. They had sought war as wanderers, survived their baptism in fire, and now found themselves the foundation of a legend in the making. The Eagle Squadron was more than an experiment. It was a promise, a foreshadowing of the day when the United States itself would be drawn into the conflict. And for Tobin, Mamedoff, and Keough, it was the next stage in a journey that had begun not with orders, but with defiance and a determination to fight when their nation would not. When the smoke of the Battle of Britain drifted away and the skies quieted, the story of the Americans who had fought there began to fade. History, shaped by politics and pride, left their names in shadow. For Britain, the struggle had been a national trial, a moment when its own pilots stood as a thin shield between the island and invasion. For America, still neutral, the very presence of its citizens in foreign cockpits was inconvenient, even embarrassing. Thus, the memory of these outlaws of the sky was pushed aside, buried beneath myths and silence. There had been at least a dozen Americans in the Royal Air Force during the summer of 1940, enough to fill a squadron of their own. They destroyed more than 15 enemy aircraft, perhaps more, though records blurred under the disguises of Canadian or Commonwealth birthplaces. Some claimed they were from Toronto or Vancouver, others from far-off dominions. In truth, their accents betrayed Illinois, California, Minnesota, or New Jersey. But official documents were unyielding. These men were not to be acknowledged as Americans. Part of the erasure came from Britain itself. The Royal Air Force was fiercely proud of its victory, proud that British pilots and British fighters had turned back Hitler's might. To admit that Americans, even a handful, had played a role seemed to dilute the purity of that triumph. And later, when the United States entered the war in full, its overwhelming presence across every theater cast a long shadow backward. Writers of history were reluctant to give attention to a few early volunteers when millions of Americans would soon fight under their own flag. The result was a strange silence. The Americans who had risked prison and exile to join the fight became ghosts in the records. Their victories were counted, but their names often miswritten or forgotten. Jimmy Davies, who had claimed 8 German aircraft before his death, was never officially recognized as America's first ace of the war. Carl Davis, who downed 11 enemies before falling in Sussex, was remembered as South African, his American parentage quietly overlooked. Billy Fiske, wealthy, charming, and doomed, was remembered as the first officially acknowledged American casualty, though others had already died. Arthur Donahue, the farm boy from Minnesota, was noted briefly, then lost amid larger tales. And then there were the 3 outlaws, Red Tobin, Andy Mamedoff, and Shorty Keough. Their story was one of restless defiance, men who had chased war across borders until they finally found it in the skies of England. They had survived Middle Wallop, Biggin Hill, and the Great Clash of September 15th. They had carried the weight of teaching new recruits in the Eagle Squadron, yet in the grand sweep of history their names rarely appeared. Why did their legacy dim? Perhaps because they had lived in deception, their identities cloaked in false papers. Perhaps because their nation did not wish to celebrate those who had broken its laws. Or perhaps because in the enormity of the conflict that followed, the handful of Americans who fought in 1940 seemed too small, too fragile to matter. And yet, their importance cannot be denied. They were proof that conscience could defy legislation, that courage could transcend borders. They stood as symbols of a truth larger than politics, that tyranny must be opposed no matter the risk. Each life lost, each victory claimed, was a stone in the foundation of the alliance that would later save Europe. Their graves remain in quiet corners of England, in Kent, in Sussex, in churchyards near the fields where their aircraft fell. Simple headstones mark the places where Americans lay, buried far from home, their passports of lies dissolved into the soil. Few visitors know their names, yet the wind that rustles through those fields carries their memory still. The legacy of these men is not written in monuments or medals, but in the very survival of Britain in its darkest hour. Without every pilot who rose to fight, British, Commonwealth or American, the story might have ended differently. That it did not is the final testament to their courage. Forgotten by many, remembered by few, the outlaw pilots of 1940 remain eternal, their sacrifice woven into the fabric of freedom itself.